Where did you take him? Jake, a 58-year-old taxi driver, had spent his entire life navigating the streets of New York. One evening, he gave a free ride to a homeless veteran. Just hours later, the FBI surrounded his house. What had he done wrong? And who was that veteran, really? If you saw a homeless person in need, would you help them? Comment, yes below. The yellow cab crawled through Manhattan's rain-soaked streets, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Inside, Jake Anderson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with the same steady resolve that had once held a rifle in distant deserts. At 58, his face carried the map of a life fully lived. Crow's feet framing eyes that had seen both the best and worst of humanity across 15 years of military service and 2 decades behind the wheel. Last far, Jake muttered to himself, glancing at the dashboard clock reading 11:38 p.m. His shift was nearly over, another night of ferrying strangers across the city coming to an end. The same routine he'd maintained since returning to civilian life after a battlefield injury forced his retirement from the Army. The taxi had become his new post, a mobile confessional where passengers shared their stories before disappearing back into the anonymity of the city. Jake's apartment waited for him, empty as it had been for 5 years since Sarah lost her battle with cancer. Their children had scattered, Michael in Seattle with his tech job, Jennifer in Chicago with her growing family. Holiday calls and occasional visits were all that remained of what had once been a home filled with laughter. Now his only constant companions were the memories that haunted the quiet corners of his mind and the strangers who briefly occupied his back seat. As he turned onto Fifth Avenue, the rain intensified, hammering against the roof like artillery fire. Through the blur of water cascading down his side window, Jake spotted a solitary figure standing beneath a streetlight. An old man, trembling in the deluge, wearing what appeared to be a faded military uniform, soaked through to the skin. No umbrella, no raincoat, just standing there as if waiting for something that might never come. Something about the man's posture, spine straight despite the obvious weight of years, triggered Jake's recognition. Military. Without hesitation, he pulled to the curb and lowered the passenger window. Need a ride somewhere? Not a great night to be standing out here, Jake called over the drumming rain. The old man's eyes, startlingly alert in his weathered face, assessed Jake for a long moment before he nodded and opened the door. Water dripped from his silver hair as he settled into the back seat, bringing with him the musty scent of wet wool and something else Jake couldn't quite identify. Something that reminded him of hospital antiseptic and old gunpowder. Where to? Jake asked, meeting the man's gaze in the rearview mirror. After a pause that stretched just beyond comfortable, the old man recited an address in a voice like gravel being crushed underfoot. It was somewhere on the outskirts, near the state forest, at least a 40-minute drive in this weather. That's quite a ways out, Jake commented, pulling back into traffic. What brings you to the city on a night like this? The old man didn't respond, his attention seemingly captured by the rain-blurred lights outside. Something about him made the hairs on Jake's neck stand at attention. A soldier's intuition that had saved his life more than once in combat zones. Served, did you? Jake tried again, gesturing toward the man's uniform. I did 15 years myself. Iraq, Afghanistan, 2 tours each. The old man's reflection in the mirror showed a slight nod, but his eyes remained fixed on the passing cityscape. Which unit? Jake pressed, the silence in the cab growing heavier than the rain outside. It doesn't exist anymore, the old man finally replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades. No one remembers us now. Jake nodded, recognizing the tone. He'd heard it before from veterans of classified operations, men who'd fought shadows in wars that would never make history books. I understand, Jake said, though something in his gut whispered that he didn't. Not really. As they left the city behind, the old man spoke again, so softly Jake almost missed it beneath the sound of tires on wet asphalt. We did things that will never be written down, he whispered. Our final mission, we weren't supposed to survive it. Then silence fell again, absolute and unyielding, despite Jake's careful attempts at conversation. Jake's apartment was shrouded in darkness when he returned, his mind still reeling from the strange events of the previous night. The wall clock displayed 2:30 a.m., He shed his soaking wet jacket, still feeling a chill deep in his bones, a sensation that had nothing to do with the weather. As he removed his jacket, something fell to the floor with a soft metallic clink. Jake bent down to pick it up, an old military medal, worn but still gleaming under the dim light. He didn't remember seeing it in his pocket before. It must have belonged to the old man. Perhaps it had fallen out when he was sitting in the cab. Jake placed the medal on the table, deciding he would find a way to return it tomorrow. He dragged himself to the bathroom, staring at his exhausted face in the mirror. There was something about the old man's eyes that still haunted him. A look as if he knew Jake better than Jake knew himself. After a quick shower, Jake collapsed onto his bed, hoping sleep would erase the bizarre memories of last night's ride. But sleep only brought nightmares of blue light and whispers from deep within the forest. A persistent knocking at the door jolted Jake awake at 4 a.m. He sat up, heart racing. Nobody visited him at this hour, certainly nothing good. He grabbed a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, then moved toward the door, where the knocking continued unabated. Through the peephole, Jake saw 3 men in dark suits standing in the hallway. Their rigid postures and alert eyes immediately triggered his military instincts. Government, probably federal. Jake opened the door, confusion evident on his face as he confronted the 3 black-suited men standing on his doorstep. "Jake Anderson," the middle one asked, his voice cold and professional. "That's me. Agent Miller, FBI." The man flashed his credentials. "We need to speak with you, right now." Jake stepped aside, allowing the agents to enter his apartment. His mind raced through possibilities, unpaid tickets, mistaken identity, or something to do with his military service. But deep down, he already knew this was about the old man. In Jake's living room, Agent Miller produced a photograph. It was the old man Jake had driven just hours ago, though in this image he wore a formal military uniform adorned with numerous decorations. "Do you know this individual?" Miller asked, studying Jake's reaction carefully. Jake hesitated. The old man's warning still echoed in his mind. "They'll come asking questions. Be careful what you tell them." "I'm not sure. I meet a lot of people every day." "Don't lie," the second agent spoke up. "We have camera footage of him entering your cab at 11:42 p.m. last night." Jake sighed. "All right, I drove him. Is there a problem?" "Where is he now?" Miller asked, urgency evident in his voice. "I dropped him off at a wooden cabin outside the city." Miller exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. "This man," Miller said slowly, "has been officially declared missing for over 20 years. His name is Colonel Robert Hayes." Jake's confusion deepened. "I don't understand. He just seemed like a homeless veteran." "Colonel Hayes was not homeless," the third agent interjected. "He commanded a special unit, and he disappeared in 2002 after a classified mission." "We need you to take us to exactly where you dropped him off," Miller stated firmly. As they drove toward the cabin in an unmarked government SUV, Jake suddenly remembered something. "Wait, he left something in my cab." Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old military medal he'd found earlier, tarnished but still gleaming under the car's interior lights. "I was going to return it but forgot." Agent Miller took the medal, examining the inscription carefully. His face suddenly paled. "Impossible." He muttered, then handed the medal to his colleague. The other agent looked at it and immediately reached for his radio. "Red code. Repeat, red code. We need immediate backup." Jake's stomach tightened. "What's going on? What does that medal mean?" "That's classified," Miller replied, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. As they approached the forest clearing, Jake pointed to an empty space among the trees. "This is where I dropped him off." But there was no wooden cabin, only scorched earth and a few charred timber remains. "Are you certain?" Miller asked, tension evident in his expression. "This cabin, it burned down 10 years ago in a fire." Jake shook his head, bewildered. "No, that's impossible. I watched him walk into that cabin. It was intact." The agents exchanged worried glances as more vehicles began arriving, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Men in tactical gear emerged, setting up a perimeter. "Fall back, immediately," Miller ordered. "But Hayes," one agent protested. "This is no longer our operation," Miller said, his voice filled with concern. "They're taking over from here." Jake watched as new personnel in unmarked uniforms began sweeping the area with strange equipment he'd never seen before, even during his military service. "What's happening?" Jake demanded. "Who are these people?" Miller turned to Jake, his expression grave. "Mr. Anderson, you're about to be debriefed by people with much higher clearance than mine. I suggest you tell them exactly what happened last night, every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." As if on cue, a tall woman in a charcoal suit approached them. Unlike the FBI agents, she wore no identification. "Mr. Anderson," she said without introducing herself, "you've stumbled into something you cannot possibly understand, but we need your help to contain it." Jake looked back at the scorched clearing where he was certain a cabin had stood just hours ago. The Huey Chong in Agent Miller's hand caught the first rays of dawn, the inscription briefly visible, Operation Threshold, 1952. The days following Jake's encounter with the FBI blurred together in a haze of paranoia and mounting tension. He tried to return to his normal routine, picking up fares, making small talk with passengers, but nothing felt normal anymore. His mind constantly replayed the events at the forest clearing, the impossible vanishing cabin, and the mysterious metal that had caused such alarm among federal agents. 1 week after the incident, Jake first noticed the black SUV. It was parked across from his apartment building, engine off but clearly occupied. The next day it appeared again, this time half a block down. By the third day, Jake was certain he was under surveillance. The phone calls began shortly thereafter. They would come at odd hours, 3:17 a.m., 2:46 p.m., no pattern he could discern. When Jake answered, there would be nothing but breathing on the other end, sometimes for several seconds before the line went dead. He tried blocking the numbers, but they called from different ones each time. On Thursday morning, Jake returned from an early shift to find something that sent ice through his veins. His apartment door was unlocked. He was meticulous about security, always had been since his military days. There was no sign of forced entry, but Jake knew with absolute certainty that he had locked the door before leaving. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. But as Jake moved through his small apartment, he noticed subtle differences. A book slightly out of alignment on his shelf, his laptop closed at a different angle than he'd left it, the window blinds adjusted by perhaps an inch. That night, after triple-checking his locks, Jake made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. He needed answers. The next morning, Jake called Mike Donovan, an old friend from his military days who had transitioned to military intelligence before retiring 3 years ago. Mike had always been the guy who knew things others didn't, the unofficial information broker of their unit. "I need to see you." "Today," Jake said when Mike answered, not bothering with pleasantries. There was a pause on the other end. "This sounds serious." "It is. Murphy's Diner, noon, back booth." Mike hung up without waiting for confirmation. The diner was nearly empty when Jake arrived, exactly why Mike had chosen it. His former comrade was already seated in the farthest booth, nursing a black coffee. Mike had aged since Jake last saw him, more gray in his beard, deeper lines around his eyes that spoke of accumulated secrets rather than just the passage of time. "You look like hell," Mike said as Jake slid into the booth. "I've been better." Jake glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot before recounting everything. The old man, the cabin, the FBI agents, and the strange metal. Mike listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When Jake finished, Mike leaned forward. "You have a picture of this metal?" Jake nodded, pulling out his phone. He'd had the foresight to snap a photo before the FBI took it. He slid the phone across the table. Mike's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color, and he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. His hands, steady through 2 combat tours, visibly trembled. "Jesus Christ, Jake," he whispered. "You've just touched something nobody is supposed to even know exists." "What is it?" Jake pressed. Mike looked around again before answering, his voice barely audible. "This isn't an ordinary metal. It's an identification marker for Unit 731, one of the most classified units that ever operated under U.S. government authority in the late 80s and early 90s. What did they do? The darkest operations imaginable. Things that would never see congressional oversight. Black sites, enhanced interrogations, operations on foreign soil that officially never happened. Mike took a long sip of his coffee. But there's something impossible about this. What do you mean? This unit was completely wiped out. All members were reported dead after a mission went catastrophically wrong in 2002. But the old man is still alive, Jake protested. That's what's impossible. Mike shook his head. Either he's not a real member of the unit, or ... Or what? Or there's something far worse going on than either of us understands. Mike reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a worn manila envelope. I made some calls last night. Called in every favor I had left. This is everything I could find on Unit 731. It isn't much. Most records were purged years ago. Jake opened the envelope and began sifting through the sparse collection of redacted documents. Most were heavily censored, with entire pages blacked out. But toward the bottom of the stack, something caught his eye. A photograph. 7 men stood in front of what appeared to be a military transport plane. Their faces were serious, their postures rigid with military discipline. And there, standing in the center, was a much younger version of the old man Jake had driven that night. That's him, Jake exclaimed, pointing. Robert Hayes, Mike confirmed grimly. Commander of Unit 731, a legend in intelligence circles before he vanished. This photo was taken just before their final mission, codenamed Phoenix Rising. No one knows what the objective was, but afterward, the entire unit disappeared. But why would the FBI be interested in him after all these years? Because he knows something they desperately want to keep buried. Mike tapped the photo. Look at the date stamp. Jake squinted at the small numbers in the corner. 05-17-2002. Now look at the location code. The code read Site-P/threshold. What's Site P? Jake asked. I don't know, Mike admitted. But threshold was mentioned on that medal, wasn't it? Operation Threshold 1952? Jake nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to form a disturbing pattern. Jake, Mike said, his voice deadly serious. Whatever Hayes was involved in spans decades, not just years. And if he's resurfaced now, after all this time... What? It means something big is about to happen. Mike gathered the documents quickly. We need to go. Now it's not safe to stay in one place too long. As they stood to leave, Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he read the simple message. The cabin is still there, Mr. Anderson. You just need to know how to see it. Tonight, midnight, same spot. Come alone. The drive back to Jake's apartment was tense and silent. Mike's warnings echoed in his mind, competing with the mysterious text message that seemed to promise answers. As Jake turned onto his street, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The lights in his apartment were off, but he distinctly remembered leaving at least one on. Jake approached his building cautiously, military training kicking in as he scanned for threats. Nothing seemed immediately amiss in the hallway, but when he reached his door, his heart sank. The window adjacent to his living room had been shattered, glass fragments scattered across the floor inside. Drawing the small pocket knife he always carried, Jake entered slowly. No sounds of an intruder, no movement in the shadows. The apartment appeared untouched. No ransacking, no obvious theft. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Jake noticed something on his coffee table that hadn't been there before. A plain brown envelope with no markings, no address, no name. Jake flipped on a light and approached the envelope cautiously. He used the knife to open it, half expecting something dangerous. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. Stop. Search no further. Forget what you've seen, for your own safety. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, the penmanship of someone from an older generation. With a chill, Jake recognized it matched the careful script he'd glimpsed when Hayes had written down the cabin address that night in the taxi. Instead of instilling fear, the warning ignited something in Jake, a stubborn determination that had carried him through his military service. If someone was trying this hard to scare him off, he must be close to something important. By dawn, Jake had made his decision. He would return to the forest clearing, not at midnight, as the text suggested, but in broad daylight when he could see what he was walking into. From a locked box under his bed, Jake retrieved something he hadn't touched since his discharge. A 9mm Beretta, military issue, that he'd kept through a paperwork oversight when leaving the service. The forest looked different in daylight, less mysterious, but somehow more foreboding in its stillness. As Jake approached the clearing where the cabin should have been, he noticed an unnatural quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves despite the gentle breeze he could feel on his skin. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The clearing appeared exactly as it had that night with the FBI. A charred foundation, blackened timber remnants scattered about. Jake circled the perimeter slowly, his hand resting on the concealed handgun. Something caught his eye. Fresh footprints in the soft earth, too defined to be more than a day old. Jake followed the tracks, moving deeper into the forest than he had ventured before. After about a quarter mile, the footprints led to a narrow ravine partially hidden by dense undergrowth. Pushing aside the branches, Jake discovered the dark mouth of a cave, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Withdrawing a small flashlight from his pocket, Jake entered cautiously. The cave wasn't natural. The walls too smooth, the floor too level. About 20 feet in, the narrow passage opened into a small chamber that showed clear signs of recent habitation. An old camping lantern, several empty food cans, and a makeshift bed of blankets. On a flat rock that served as a table lay a weathered leather portfolio. Jake opened it with trembling hands to find yellow documents stamped with top secret and eyes only. The title page read, Operation Phoenix Rising, Phase 3 Implementation. As Jake flipped through the pages, his confusion deepened. The documents detailed experiments in what appeared to be temporal displacement, scientific jargon for what laymen would call time travel. Equations and diagrams filled many pages, but one handwritten note in the margin stood out. We didn't fail. We succeeded too well. That's the problem. You shouldn't have come here, Jake. Jake spun around, drawing his weapon in one fluid motion. Standing at the cave entrance was Hayes, but not the elderly man he'd driven that night. This was a middle-aged man, perhaps 50, with the same piercing eyes but fewer lines on his face, his posture straight and military rigid. Who are you? Jake demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm Robert Hayes, the same man you drove that night. Impossible. He was at least 30 years older than you. Hayes smiled sadly. He was also me. From another point in time. Jake kept the gun trained on Hayes. Explain, now. Phoenix Rising wasn't an ordinary mission, Hayes said, stepping further into the chamber. It was an experiment in temporal displacement. We succeeded, but at a terrible cost. You're saying it was time travel? That's impossible. Is it? You saw the cabin, Jake, a cabin that burned down a decade ago. You drove a version of me that shouldn't exist for another 20 years. Hayes gestured to the documents. Our unit became untethered from linear time. Each of us exists simultaneously at multiple points in our own timelines. We don't age normally, we don't die. We just continue across multiple time streams. Jake struggled to process what he was hearing. Does the FBI know about this? They know parts of it. They want the technology, but they don't understand its consequences. Why tell me this? Why involve me at all? Because you're the anomaly, Jake, Hayes said, his expression grave. You weren't supposed to be able to see the cabin that night. No ordinary person can perceive objects displaced in time unless... Unless what? Unless they've been exposed to the field before. Hayes stepped closer. The question isn't why I chose your taxi, Jake. The question is, why can you see things that exist outside your time stream? 1 week after the cave encounter, Jake's phone rang with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his nerves still raw from everything he discovered. Jake Anderson, a crisp, authoritative voice came through. This is Director of Special Operations Davis, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jake's grip tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? That's hardly relevant, Mr. Anderson. I'd like to meet with you. Today, if possible. The address Davis provided led Jake to an unmarked office building downtown. No FBI logos, no government signage, just a nondescript security desk where a stern-faced guard checked his ID before directing him to the 11th floor. The elevator opened directly into a minimalist reception area where a woman in a charcoal suit escorted Jake without a word through heavy wooden doors. Inside, a distinguished older man with silver hair and an immaculate navy suit stood gazing out floor-to-ceiling windows. "Thank you for coming, Jake," he said without turning. "I believe we need to discuss Colonel Hayes." Jake remained standing, wary. "Who exactly are you?" The man turned, revealing a weathered face with intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate Jake with clinical precision. "I'm Director Davis. I've been overseeing what we call temporal anomalies for the past 17 years. "You mean people stuck between time streams," Jake said flatly. A flicker of surprise crossed Davis's face. "Hayes told you more than I expected." "Some people never truly disappear," Davis continued, gesturing for Jake to sit. "They simply exist in places we can't reach." Jake took the offered seat but remained tense. "Why am I here?" "Because you've stumbled into something the government has been concealing since 2002. Phoenix Rising was never meant to produce the effects it did. The consequences were unforeseen." "You mean turning soldiers into time travelers?" Davis winced slightly. "That's an oversimplification, but essentially correct. Unit 731 members now exist outside conventional temporal flow. We can't help them, but we also can't allow this technology to escape containment." "So why did the elderly Hayes seek me out?" Jake asked. Davis smiled sadly. "Because you're the son of James Anderson, the engineer who designed the temporal displacement device for Phoenix Rising." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His father had died when he was 8. A car accident, his mother had told him. A tragic, ordinary death that had shaped his entire childhood. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. "Your father was brilliant, Mr. Anderson. He created something revolutionary, something that shouldn't have been possible for another century. But when he realized what his creation had done to Hayes and the others, he tried to shut it down." "The car accident," Jake said numbly. Davis nodded. "Not an accident. Your father was the only person who might have been able to fix this mistake. Hayes hoped you might have inherited your father's insights." Jake thought of the USB drive Hayes had pressed into his hand in the cave, now hidden in his apartment. "What happens now?" "Nothing," Davis said simply. "This is beyond our capabilities to resolve. Let it rest." Jake nodded slowly. "I understand." But he didn't. Or rather, he understood something different than what Davis intended. In his pocket was the key to his father's legacy. Research that might help men trapped between moments of time. 1 year later, Jake's taxi sat gathering dust in long-term parking. His days of driving passengers through rainy nights were behind him. Instead, he spent every waking hour in his garage, converted now into a workshop filled with complex electronic equipment and whiteboards covered in equations he was only beginning to understand. The doorbell rang one morning as Jake was soldering a delicate circuit. He wiped his hands and opened the door to find a package with no return address. Inside was an old photograph, his father standing alongside a young Hayes and other Unit 731 members, all in military fatigues, standing before what appeared to be a massive machine. Jake turned the photo over. On the back, a handwritten message read, "Thank you, Jake. We'll meet again, in another timeline." Jake smiled. Returning to his workbench where the blueprints for a device his father never completed lay spread out, a machine designed to repair fractures in time. As he worked, Jake thought about how a simple act of kindness, a free ride on a rainy night, had opened the door to secrets the world wasn't ready to face. Some stories never find complete resolution. Some people never truly disappear. We simply lose the ability to see them. But sometimes, the smallest gesture of compassion can ripple across time itself, creating possibilities that defy the very laws of nature. And in those moments, the impossible becomes merely improbable, waiting for someone with the courage to reach across the boundaries that separate us from what might have been. Some mysteries are never solved. Some people disappear without a trace, but their stories still find a way back to us. What would you have done in James's place? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where real courage, real mysteries, and real justice come to life.